There's more women in work now than there's ever been. We've got a better educated female workforce. Women are leaving very well qualified from school and higher education, more women than men in higher education now. Everything tells us that there's some positive signs there. And that has been a picture that's been gradually developing over the last 30, 40 years. That's not a sudden change. Women have been participating in the labour market increasingly over that period of time. But when you actually start to look at the quality of work and the types of work that women are doing, then you start to see it as a bit more of a troubling picture, really. And it's interesting, the Resolution Foundation have been talking about full employment today, and it's really nice in a way to see the concept of full employment coming back into fashion. But, I would say, and Fawcett would say, we've really got to look at what kind of work people are doing, what they're earning, the security of work and so on. And that's, I think, the sort of debate for the 21st century. So women tend to be going into part-time work, and it's part-time work and low-paid part-time work that is growing. Also, increasingly, female entrepreneurs, self-employed women who are actually doing quite low-level work, so childcare, cleaning, they're being defined as self-employed, but actually they're quite low-paid jobs. And 36% of women who are in those low-paid jobs, according to Fawcett research, would describe themselves as overqualified for the work that they're doing. So immediately you've got a skills gap in terms of what they're capable of doing and what they're being paid to do. And then the other gap that we see for women working part-time is often they would actually like to do more hours. But when they have a child, have a family, they may trade down their hours in order to balance their work and caring roles, and then can't get back up, because if you request a reduction in hours, it's treated as a permanent change to your contract. The right to go back up again would actually help a lot of those women who get a bit trapped in low-paid part-time work over their rest of their working lives. And thinking about mothers in work, again, we've seen an increasing number of mums returning to work, but we're not getting the kind of levels that, say, they achieve in Denmark or other parts of Europe. And that's because we're not putting enough resource and investment into our childcare infrastructure. We're not supporting dads to share the caring work either. And so the burden of care, the expectation to care and the responsibility to care very much falls on mothers' shoulders still. So we've talked about women being concentrated in low-paid part-time work, but they're often also concentrated in certain sections of the economy. So when you look at the gender segregation in our economy, it's really stark. You've got 80% of the caring workforce is female, 87% of the science, technology and engineering and manufacturing workforce is male. That just seems a bit crazy, doesn't it, in 2016, that all these amazingly educated young women coming out of school and university, and yet only 21% of A-level physics students are women. So we're not giving our girls the opportunities they should be getting to move into some of the non-traditional roles that girls have previously not been doing. And actually, we're not really supporting men to care either, and we're not valuing the caring roles that we have in our society, so they don't become attractive for men to take up because they're low paid and poorly valued and rewarded. So we know that the pay gap, and we hear a lot about that at the moment, government has been very welcome, it is too, saying they're going to require large companies, employers with 250 staff or more, to publish their gender pay gap figures, their headline gender pay gap figures. And we welcome that, we want to see it happen, we want to see the regulations strengthened. There's more that they could do to make that have some teeth and make it really bite, but it's really significant as a step towards understanding inequality in the workplace and what's driving it. They're also going to be requiring companies to look at where women are within their workplaces, so they're at the top or the bottom, and publishing that data as well. So that's another welcome step. And they're going to be requiring companies to publish the pay gap for bonus payments as well as for basic pay. And that's a bit of a win for us, because I think that's really significant, especially in sectors like the finance industry, where the pay gap is so much bigger than it is nationally. It's 14% for mean full-time work is the gender pay gap, so it means men earn 14% per hour than women do. For part-time work, men earn about a third more than women in part-time work, so the gap is huge for part-time. But in the finance sector, it's a 35% gap, and for black and Asian and minority ethnic women, the pay gap will be bigger still. And what we would say is that the pay gap is a productivity gap, it's a signifier of a waste of talent and skills that we're not using in our economy. And it's an absolute tragedy for the individual women who aren't rewarded, but of course it's a waste for the economy that we need to address it. The thing that's changing, I think, and this is where I have a note of optimism, I suppose, increasingly employers are seeing it as something that they need to deal with and they need to address, which is why the regulations have been introduced at all, there is at least an opening to thinking, actually, this is something that's relevant for us as an employer because we're wasting our female talent. So I think there has been a shift, at least in some employers, in the way they're thinking about that. Thinking about the causes of the pay gap, we've talked about occupational segregation. Well, obviously, the unequal impact of caring roles is another huge driver of that. We've got some new data we're publishing next week for International Women's Day, which looks at the caring roles that women and men play and the way they're perceived when they have children at work. So who becomes more or less committed at work? What's the motherhood penalty and the daddy bonus, if you like, in terms of the way women and men are perceived at work? And we've also asked about, well, who takes on the caring role? So is it you or your partner who does all the work around children? So I always get frustrated when I hear people talk about, men are doing more childcare, but, what about the chores? What about the washing up? And I think, well, no, actually, what about the hospital visits or the doctor's visits, the dentist trips, the pick-ups from school, the bath times, all the things that wrap around children? And we don't often talk about that. So we're publishing some interesting stats next week which show how women and men are perceiving it for themselves. But I think the other thing that doesn't get talked about enough is discrimination. 54,000 women each year experience pregnancy discrimination. So they feel driven out of their jobs or sacked for being pregnant. But with all the focus on the causes of the pay gap and measuring the pay gap, the noise is off. The narrative around that is saying, well, we haven't got pay discrimination anymore. It doesn't happen. All we've got is to sort out these other things and, then it'll all be fine. And I just say, no. Of course, pay discrimination still happens. Why would we think it doesn't? Just because it's illegal. It's been illegal since 1970. Well, what we don't do is find out about it because we have no pay transparency in our workplaces and we don't equip individual women to have the information so that they can bring a case and bring a challenge. And we also now have employment tribunal fees of £1,200 in order to bring a claim. And we've seen 80% reduction in discrimination cases as a result of those fees, like a cliff edge as soon as they came in. Things coming down the track towards us, changing labour market. The biggest thing on the horizon for us, I think, as a society is the ageing population and caring. And we really are not at all equipped to respond to it, to support the caring role that women and men need to play. We say the 27% of the female population are economically inactive. It's like a sort of black hole they disappear into. The majority of those people will be very, very important, making important contributions to their family, to their society, to the economy in terms of caring for somebody else. Without question, that's what a lot of those people will be doing, but we don't count it and we don't value it. So I would like to see a different measure. Who are the active carers and who are the not active carers? Let's start to count and value something, which actually as a society we're going to need far more of as we go forward. And if we don't, I really dread to think what will happen to both to our older population who really need the care, but also to older women in their 50s often, who are the ones expected to do the caring. So where, are they going to be picking up the slack? Or are they going to be under even more pressure to do both working longer and caring more?
Daniele, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about Token Man, kind of think shifting tact really. Token Man is about creating this kind of cultural shift within the workplace, helping men to be able to contribute in a tangible way towards addressing gender inequality. Can you just tell us a little bit about what the initiative is and what you've found so far?
I work in advertising, and for those that know advertising is a massive issue when it comes to creative directors. I mean, there's a famous stat that 3% of creative directors are female. 3%. I mean, that's a. I think in the UK it's gone up to something like 7%. But I run a collective of 300 creative directors. We've been running it for 11 years. It's been an issue for us in terms of diversity, and we've just done something called the Great British Diversity Experiment. And diversity leads to creativity. So it's a fundamental issue for the industry. So we've spent quite a lot of time trying to recruit women, and I worked with a friend of mine called Laura Jordan-Bamback. She runs the brilliant network called She Says, and we did a dinner. I didn't even think about it. We hosted this dinner, and it was to recruit more women. And I turned up, and there were 13 women and me. It was one of the worst dinners I've ever had. I hated it. And all of a sudden, I understood for the first time in my working life what it meant to be a woman in the minority. But all of a sudden, I saw a change in behaviour in myself in terms of confidence. I saw a change in behaviour in Laura in the way that she actually treated me. And there were simple things like the ability to have conversations around you. And all of a sudden I found conversations were happening that I had no affinity to. And I came out of that, and it was enlightening. It was the first time I'd ever felt something like that. And it did change some of my behaviours. So simple things like Tuesday morning, we're men, we're quite a lot support football. The first thing we go into management meeting, we talk about the football. Straight away I'm cutting out, I realised for the first time ever that I was cutting out the women who in that particular case had no interest in football. And when they're a minority, that makes it very hard. And then I spoke at a very intimate breakfast with a company called Hyper Island. This was in Sweden. It was a time when this was gender diversity was a major issue in Sweden, which I didn't know about the elections. And someone really aggressively attacked what Creative Social were doing because of the amount of male faces. And do you know what? I'm not proud of the way I reacted. I got defensive. I didn't give a good answer. I didn't talk about all the positive things we were doing. For a lot of women in the room, that was fine because they came up and spoke to me. But for one woman, she didn't like you. And do you know what? I got back and I was so angry because I just felt that finger pointing wasn't the way to actually create change. You know, I was there doing stuff in the background, and I said there has to be a better way. And so I spoke to Emma, who was a creative director at Chair with me, and we decided to launch Token Man. So Token Man really is about creating an environment where men can talk about diversity in a way where they're not going to be challenged, so they can be educated. We don't know the answers, but the only way to actually educate people and to create change is through discussion and through positive discussions, and that's what we're doing with Token Man. So we tried to do dinners, we tried to recreate it, but that was too hard, and we realised we didn't have permission or we didn't have a voice. So what we've been doing is we've been doing interviews. So we've been getting senior female execs to interview senior male execs about diversity. So we've done about 12 interviews so far. It tends to be CEOs who are running agencies. And the nice thing for us in terms of learning is, firstly, there are some enlightened men out there who are doing some really good initiatives, but even they accept there's more they need to be doing. I mean, a good example is read the interview with Darren Rubens. Darren Rubens is doing some fantastic work, especially around parents and about bringing people back into the workplace. And PhD as an organisation has seen some huge changes in terms of what they're doing. What we've also seen, which has been extremely encouraging, is we're starting to get anecdotal evidence that we're having immediate change. So of those 12 interviews, I know one interview has led to 2 women being promoted to board within 1 month. Because they've looked at it and they go, do you know what, we haven't done this because we are challenged. The second example is I know 2 women have been given pay increases because they looked at the pay gap. We asked them a question about pay gap. The CEOs looked at it and said, OK, I'm going to go and look at this properly. They've looked at it properly, and within 1 week, 2 women got pay increases. So for me, I think what we are trying to do is trying to get more men into the discussion, because I was mentioning it before, but I kind of forced to go to more of these things myself, because the last thing I am is enlightened. And firstly, it's a shame to be in the audience, and I usually am the token man. We didn't realise what a genius name it was, but you end up being the token man. But Chloe, who runs something called the Gender Blog, she said something that I thought was really interesting, which is no minority is actually being able to make change without the support of the majority. And so for me, this is an issue that needs men and women working together to actually solve.
Dawn, and then finally to you. When we talk about the system, it's always something that people feel very removed from and very disempowered to tackle. So I suppose my question to you is, if the system is making life difficult for women, how can we break through the challenges the system is presenting us from within the workplace?
A colleague came home and she worked in technology, and she said that she was increasingly sick of the fact that even though she was a manager, she managed a mostly male team and felt constantly undermined in the workplace. And she felt there was this kind of culture that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't really change, because her colleagues who were kind of one rung on the kind of ladder were so resistant to any kind of cultural change that she was constantly, made to feel kind of hysterical and emotional and every kind of, stereotypical female phrase you can think of. So when she decided, without asking anybody, to start a kind of women's group to talk amongst female managers about what they were experiencing, how they could change the culture and what the problems were, a male manager much higher up in the company found out. and invited himself along without asking, and said, oh, I thought what would be really, really good is if you all went away and read this Sheryl Sandberg book. I think it'll be really, really helpful, and it'll probably save you a lot of time with this little group you've got. And so she came home, started reading it, got bored, gave it to me. I'm mostly a kind of social affairs and political journalist, so I spent a lot of time travelling around the country, looking at cuts and looking at poverty, looking at most marginalised people, so talking to people who are disabled, people who are carers, asylum seekers, women who've experienced domestic violence. And I just became increasingly infuriated at the idea that change comes solely from within, when most of the women I spoke to had very deliberately had all of their power taken away from them. And a lot of that was down to just straight economics. I mean, Fawcett have been at the forefront of this. I mean, you did that great report that showed that when you look at the cuts that happened between 2010 and 2015, 80% of them fell on women. That's absolutely huge. So we've had employment tribunal fees introduced, so women can't take their employers to court for sexual harassment or pay discrepancies unless they pay. We've had the withdrawal of legal aid, so dozens and dozens of hundreds of women have been denied justice. At the same time, we've had bedroom tax, we've had benefit cuts, we've had cut upon cut upon cut, which, because women are paid less, because women care more, falls on women over and over again. So I found it quite galling. I couldn't imagine speaking to a woman who was affected by the bedroom tax, cared for her disabled child, and couldn't work because she was saving the state money by caring for this child herself. And I couldn't imagine saying to her, have you considered kind of leaning in a bit more? So I felt that this actually spoke to a kind of a movement that I'd seen in feminism myself since I think I first kind of came across the idea that feminism was relevant to me when I went to university. I remember when I was in sixth form in a very kind of working class area in South Wales, one of my friends was reading a book about feminism. Every single boy in the sixth form common room took the absolute mick out of her. Every single stereotype about, second wave feminists that unreconstructed, like Neanderthal, like children, could come up with was thrown at her. And I just assumed, oh, that's, it must be weird, it's nothing to do with me. And then I went to university, was lucky enough to have a lot of lecturers who introduced a lot of feminism and theory into their courses, and realised that actually feminism is as much about class as it is about gender. I think part of the reason why Sheryl Sandberg is able to get to the top is because she comes from a relatively affluent background. Her previous partner was very, very wealthy, and she's very wealthy. She is able to pay for people to care for her children at no huge detriment to her. And so the kind of things that she suggests are not applicable to most people, because most people can't go to their employer and say, I would like a pay rise. Because if you look at 0 hours contracts, 75% of the people on 0 hours contracts are women. If those women go to their employer at Sports Direct or various other places and say, I'd actually quite like a pay rise and more hours, those women know that they're in such a precarious position that all that will happen is they never get work again. But I'd seen this trend moving more and more away from viewing feminism as a kind of movement that involved making a rising tide that lifted everybody, and focusing more on individuals and glass ceilings and less on women's economic condition after the recession and sticky floors, which Fawcett are very good on. If you look at what's happened after the recession, so many women have found that the progress they previously felt has gone backwards. So, I mean, there's been a huge rise in self-employment, which is seen as kind of economic freedom. For most of the women I speak to who are self-employed, because they're self-employed, it means that their opportunity to have maternity leave that will actually sustain them is almost zero. I spoke to a woman who was self-employed the other day. Her partner's also self-employed, and she'd recently found out she's pregnant, and she worked out that if she took maternity leave, she would be given £600 a month. And she lives in London and has a flat. Her partner earns less than she does, and she realised that she would just have to have a baby and after 2 weeks go straight back to work. And she couldn't see how this was remotely feasible, and she was relatively affluent compared to much poorer women. I feel as though we have to think more about how little we can often do within a structure, and think more about female solidarity across class, across race, across all types of economic barriers. Do what Fawcett do, what a lot of people do, what lots of grassroots groups do, and never ever stop talking about exactly how disadvantaged women are, about how small kind of government changes in bills that they imply mean very little, have a huge day-to-day impact on thousands and thousands of women. So I think we do need to kind of lean out of the idea that we can get to the top by incorporating ourselves into this culture and by copying male characteristics and male work culture, and instead talk more about what we can do to make workplaces more female friendly, but also how the economy can incorporate women more.